Hello everyone, Scienter here with my Guild Wars 1 skill review project. Today we're going to be talking about the Paragon. We're going to introduce the profession, its specific and unique mechanics, and we're going to discuss it a bit, but we're going to need to understand sort of the context for it, because there's a lot that I've been thinking about as I've been trying to process the Paragon, and as I've been thinking about it more and more, the more I've come to realize it ran into a problem that ArenaNet was having with making Guild Wars 1. So the model that they had initially concepted was that they would come out with a game, and then every 6 months they'd come out with another game, another standalone campaign. They ran into a number of issues, one of which was growing complexity, which is a problem that games like Magic the Gathering has. This game did have modeling after TCGs, so there is some similarity there. And so they were running into that problem of growing complexity. How do we make tutorials to cover all of these mechanics that are getting added and all that sort of stuff? It's potentially a solvable problem, but it's a very difficult one to solve well. The other thing that they're running into as a very serious issue was design space. And adding new professions became increasingly difficult because the initial 6 of Necromancer, Warrior, Monk, Mesmer, Ranger, and Elementalist covers a lot of conceptual space, right? Your Elementalist is kind of your traditional offensive Black Mage sort of archetype. The Monk is the healing archetype with a little bit of divine judgment type stuff, smiting stuff thrown in and smiting prayers, but that was never really explored very well in terms of a lot of those skills are kind of weak, which open up space for the Dervish to kind of fit into that archetypal spot. The Ranger is kind of your nature, your bow user, pets, that sort of stuff. It fills a nice spot. Warrior is, your frontline fighter. But this is where we come into some of these issues, right? Because it has the tactics attribute line. The Paragon is concepted as basically a battlefield commander. That's kind of the conceit of it, whereas the Dervish was kind of like your offensive monk type of idea, your holy agent of the gods. That was kind of in the offensive capacity rather than the defensive one as the monk is. The Paragon, which makes sense for what Nightfall is doing with all the god stuff, with the whole Sun Spear thing, never fight alone, all of those sorts of being a leader of heroes and that sort of stuff. The Paragon makes a lot of sense. But it's kind of like taking the warrior's tactics attribute line and expanding it to be a full profession. And there's some problems with that in terms of design space. How much design space is really in that conceit, and how are you going to execute on it? And so, the more you go, the more you kind of expand, and the more things start getting tighter and tighter with design space. I think areas were reasonably okay for the Assassin and the Ritualist, but by the time you got to Nightfall, and we're introducing the Dervish and the Paragon, the space was getting narrower still. And the Dervish had a bit of room to play in that its conceit was being kind of this holy warrior, and sort of part of the way that was expressed was this new idea of having enchantments that would add to itself and then remove from itself. And using enchantments as a resource was kind of a new concept that was rather interesting and worked out pretty well. The problem with the Paragon is it was conceived as a battlefield commander, space that tactics was kind of sitting in with some very useful skills like Watch Yourselves, and then trying to turn that into a full character, a full profession. So we have this narrower design space that they're trying to play in, and they did some unique mechanics with it. So let's go ahead and begin discussing some of those mechanics. Let's actually start off with attribute lines this time. I know you usually start with skill types and stuff like that, but we're going to get into that. So our attribute lines for the Paragon are Spear Mastery, Command, Motivation, and Leadership. Spear Mastery is for spears. It's the weapon of the Paragon. The Paragon is kind of adjacent to a warrior in many regards, but is differentiated. The spear is a ranged weapon, unlike the weapons that the warrior has access to. This allows the Paragon to be able to, and it has pretty good range. If I step back here, I have to get just inside the aggro bubble, and I think that's very intentional, because a lot of the Paragon's skills are in earshot range, which is what the aggro bubble right here, this white bubble, it might be a little hard to see. Maybe I should try some fancy editing to blow it up, but we'll see. But this is why, actually, I could... Oh, this is a terrible idea. This right here okay, if I make it real big, this white bubble here is the earshot range. And so that is basically that's the area of effect that a lot of the Paragon skills are in. If you look at them, I have to close this. This is within earshot. Within earshot. So all of these skills, for the most part, are a lot of the Paragon skills, I should say, are shouts and chants that are within earshot range. And so having the attack range be basically just under earshot works out really well for sort of the spacing. There's a couple of reasons why. It allows the Paragon to be kind of in between the front line and the back line, so it catches everyone in earshot. And it allows it to be kind of a physically offensive class, but it also has a lot going on to differentiate it from... Let's get my compass back down to the size I like it. About there, I guess. But it also has a lot of stuff going on to differentiate it from bows. So a specific example of this is bows cannot inflict deep wound. Spears can. Also, bows traditionally were bad at inflicting bleeding. Spears have a specific skill right here, which makes it very easy for them to inflict bleeding. On the other hand, bows are really good at interrupting. And the only interrupt that the Paragon has is just a straight interrupt. We'll get into dazed later. Paragons are actually decent at inflicting dazed. But, so I guess that was later. But this is the only interrupt that it has, and it's a very conditional interrupt. It's unwieldy and a bit awkward to use. You can, but it's clearly not as good at straight-up interrupting as bows are. So the other thing, too, is it uses adrenaline rather than energy. So what you see with this is that spears are clearly being defined away from some of the warrior weapons. It's a ranged weapon, but also away from bows by being capable in different areas. So that's kind of what Spear Mastery is about. And it's got a bunch of spear attacks and that sort of thing. Then there's Command. Command as an attribute line tends to be more focused on shouts, which is one of the two sort of mechanics that Paragons have that are kind of the way that they command. So they have shouts, which warriors had previously, and there's technically some ranger shouts for like pets and stuff like that. And then there's chants. So chants have this sort of animation. They're very similar to a shout, and if I attack this thing a bit and get some adrenaline, I can use this to show the animation again. Chants are very similar to shouts in that they have an area of effect and earshot range and all that sort of stuff. A lot of the Paragon skills care about chants and shouts simultaneously, but they have an activation time. That's the big difference between a chant and a shout. A shout does not have any activation time, and a chant does. So Command focuses more on shouts, and Motivation focuses more on chants. And Command tends to be a little bit more offensively oriented, and Motivation tends to be a little bit more defensively oriented, or support-oriented, perhaps, could be a good way of saying it. And then there's the primary attribute line of Leadership. And this is where this is part of what causes problems for the Paragon. There's a lot of different issues. Like, I'm going to say it right now. I think the Paragon, as a profession as a whole, is very poorly designed for a lot of different reasons. That's not the same thing as saying it's bad, but what I am saying is that I think that the conceit of being a battlefield commander is a good one, but the implementation, the execution of it, has a lot of issues. That makes it very difficult to make it function well in a way that's balanced and balanceable. This is actually something that can be seen through the sheer number of PvP versions of skills that the Paragon has. I think there's only one profession that might have more than it. Ritualist was very high because a lot of the spirits have shorter cast or activation times in PvE. But there are a bunch of PvP only skill or PvP versions of skills for the Paragon. A lot of them clustered in Command just because it's very difficult to balance, especially shouts. So Leadership is the primary attribute, and it reads, you gain 2 energy for each ally affected by one of your shouts or chants, maximum of 1 energy for every 2 ranks. So the basic way that this works is it's an energy generation mechanic. It's an energy management mechanic, similar to how Soul Reaping is for the Necromancer. So unlike, say, Ranger or Dervish, whose primary attribute is an energy management attribute as well, and it's an energy management by decreasing the cost of the skills that they're using within certain subsets, like Soul Reaping, leadership produces just raw energy that you can put to anything. This, however, the way that it works is it requires you to affect allies. The more allies you affect, the more energy you get. So to kind of summarize, at 12 leadership, which is what I currently have, the maximum energy I can gain from leadership is 6. And then I gain 2 energy for each ally that is affected by one of my shouts or chants. So when I use them, when it affects an ally, I gain 2 energy. It was originally 1 energy, but it was changed to 2 energy in order to make it more compatible with 4-person areas and stuff like that, because this is one of the problems. This requires you to have allies around you. It means that the Paragon is naturally weaker in solo situations because they have less energy throughput. And a bunch of their skills also care about allies being near you. An example of that actually is right here, Leader Zeal. You gain energy for each nearby ally. All right, for each nearby ally, you gain 2 energy, maximum of 11. So if I use this skill over here where there's a bunch of allies, remember, allies does not necessarily mean party members. Some skills distinguish. So for example, Anthem of Flame affects party members within earshot. So if I use this, I will gain 2 energy because I affected myself. This is in contrast to Energizing Finale, or Energizing Course here, excuse me, which says each ally. So if I use that, I'm going to gain the full 6 because there are enough allies near me. Leader Zeal will gain me 8 energy right now because I have 4 allies near me. Keep in mind, nearby range is this. So if I stand here in the middle, it would count that guy nearby, this guy at adjacent, this guy at nearby, and myself. So if I used it while standing in the middle, I gain 8 energy from those. So that's like a mechanic that the Paragon has. And so leadership, basically the problem here is that the design of leadership incentivizes the design of shouts and chants that affect all party members or all allies. It makes skills that target single party members and single allies less effective, less good, because you're not able to get as much energy back from it. So, for example, It's Just a Flesh Wound says target other ally loses all conditions. It's an elite shout, and if a condition was removed in this way, that ally moves faster for a little bit. This skill right here, like, I can have a bunch of allies in earshot, but when I use this, I'm only going to gain 2 energy because it's affected 1 ally. That's how this skill works. I could go over to this area, say the student of Poison, who is an ally, and get in earshot range. So, and use It's Just a Flesh Wound. They're going to be cured of poison, and then it's going to end. Now, for some reason, I'm gaining 4 energy from it, and I'm not quite sure why. Maybe it's double triggering because it removed the condition and then removed the other thing. Either way, that's very weird. And not typical behavior. But then there's also, like, find their weaknesses single targets, a very good skill. We'll get to that one later. But anyway, my point here is that this means that the Paragon is encouraged to affect all allies. The other thing is, how does one be a battlefield commander? Like, how does that work mechanically? What's the mechanical expression of that? And critically, how does that differ from, say, the warrior tactics line that the Paragon is kind of inspired by, or at least looks to be inspired by? How's it going to be different from that? How's it going to be different from something like Watch Yourself that gives all allies armor, or Shields Up that gives you a bunch of allies a bunch of armor against piercing attacks or ranged attacks or whatever it says? Like, how is it going to be mechanically differentiated from those sorts of things? What's it going to do? And what ArenaNet settled on is it has this shouts and chants sort of feel. So it's basically this idea of, like, it's projecting stuff out from it. But because it focuses on helping all allies, you begin to run into problems. Helping all allies can be incredibly powerful. So how do you make that reasonable? It's difficult. And that's part of what the problem is. So what you end up running into is I expect a lot of these skills to get 2s, especially in motivation, because many of them are very narrow. Like right here, Course of Restoration. The next time each ally with an earshot uses a shout or chant, that ally is healed for 74. This encourages me to bring a bunch of shouts and chants. Or even Anthem of Flame. The next attack skill used by each party member with an earshot also causes burning for 3 seconds. If I want to maximize the use of this skill, I need to have attack skills on every party member. Or Lyric of Purification. The next time each ally with an earshot uses a signet, that ally loses a condition. This only works effectively if I have signets on my party. If I don't have party members with signets, the skill doesn't help them. And so on and so forth. It's an issue with the Paragon of a lot of the skills are very specific, like they benefit this thing, and it feels like to get maximum value out of it, you need to then go full in on that thing on your party. And what ends up happening is there's kind of a push towards bringing as many Paragons as possible to kind of make maximum use of some of the skills, especially the skills that specifically benefit other shouts and chants. So Course of Restoration, Energizing Chorus, as a couple of examples. But there's also another thing that incentivizes that, and that's the Echo mechanic. The Echo is a specific skill type that applies some sort of buff. There's 2 varieties. There's the Finale variety, and there's the Refrain variety. Refrains refresh whenever a shout or chant ends on the affected ally. So if I use Mending Refrain on myself, you'll notice it's ticking down. If I use... I don't know where I'm running right now. If I use Anthem of Flame, and if that were to end, like when that ends, Mending Refrains is refreshed, right? You can see that. It gets refreshed in duration. I'm just going to auto-attack this thing because that's going to be useful to have some adrenaline. So that's how refrains work, is that they refresh whenever a shout or chant ends. There's some problems with this mechanic, but I think this is the better design of the two. Now, the thing that's important to remember about shouts, chants, and echoes is there's no way to remove them from someone, aside from killing them, which removes all status things from them. That's the only way to get them off of somebody. That makes them very difficult to balance, because having unremovable health regen like this can be quite strong. So that's a huge issue, especially with shouts, because you can't do much about shouts. Like, there's no natural counterplay. There's a bunch of unnatural counterplay that was introduced in Nightfall, by which I mean there was specifically skills to target them. So Roaring Winds from the Ranger that makes shouts and chants cost more energy to use, or Vocal Minority, Ulcerous Lungs, and Well of Silence that the Necromancer has to specifically counteract the use of these sorts of skills. But the fact that they have very awkward counterplay, like later a bunch of Mesmer's interrupts that could affect spells were able to affect chants, and that helps some, but it doesn't alleviate the issue entirely. And so the other one, the other type of echo, the finale type, triggers whenever a chant or shout ends on a target non-spirit ally. None of these can go on spirits. And that incentivizes you to bring as many shouts and chants as possible. This is, I think, a big culprit, because, like, I apply this to myself and say when that ends, building up by, like, using it, for example, I gain health. I use that, and then this, and I gain health. Finales are very parasitic, which is the idea of they build on the same thing, but they're incredibly synergistically aggressive with shouts and chants. They encourage you to stack your party with as many shouts and chants as possible, but not just any shouts, to be clear. Shouts that have a duration. So something that, I mean, we'll get to go for the eyes later, but something that's just like, do I have a good example in Paragon, or is it more of a warrior thing? It might be more of a warrior thing. But shouts that just have some sort of immediate effect when you use them and don't leave a thing, I don't believe trigger finales. And actually, there is an example. I think inspirational speech is a skill. Make your time. Right here, it's a shout that gains you a strike of adrenaline for each party member within earshot. I don't think this triggers any finales. That's an example of the sort of skill I mean. So it encourages you to load up on short duration or quick to end shouts and chants of many different types across your party to trigger them as much as possible, which leads to very snowball effects. If you have everything going, then it becomes very powerful, but if you don't, then they're very weak. This makes them extremely difficult to balance because you either balance them around the extreme case, at which point then they're functional at that level and not broken, but then people have to so distort what they're doing in order to make use of them that it's not worth it. So if you try to make them where they're like reasonable at like a medium tier, which is probably where you have to target, they're not quite worth using unless you're loading up a decent amount, and they become overpowered when you have a lot of shouts and chants that you're using. So it's extremely difficult to balance, and that's a huge problem with the design of the Echo mechanic. And so the Echo mechanic or skill type or whatever you want to call it only further exacerbates the inherent issue, and that brings us back to how are you being a battlefield commander? How are you distinguishing yourself? How are you going to be different from a tactics warrior? How are you going to be different from a ritualist or a monk? How are you going to be different from a necromancer that's running a bunch of party support? And I think there are ways that could have been addressed to some extent. There could have been more shouts, for example, in Chance 2, but shouts that affected enemies. There could have been more things that were single target. But it is a difficult question, and it is hard to answer. And on top of that, using skill types that are inherently non-interactive in the way that they are also is extremely difficult to balance around. So the Paragon is, unfortunately, I think, a very bad design because I think it is difficult to balance it well, and I think that they kept adding mechanics that compounded it. And in terms of like the Echo and leadership, because like Echoes encourage you to have as many shouts and chants as possible, and leadership encourages you to make all of your shouts and chants affect as many party members as possible, because that's how the Paragon profession is designed to function. So, all of that said, there are a lot of other issues with the Paragon that we'll get into over time. One of the big ones that I'm going to call out right now is, from an offensive standpoint, Spear Mastery has no AoE capability whatsoever. And that is a great debilitation for it. With Ranger's bows, you have the ability to use something like Volley and Barrage, and all of the other melee weapons have AoE capabilities. And the fact that spears have no intrinsic AoE capabilities. There's some exceptions like Holy Spear, which has very, very, very conditional AoE, but there's no reliable AoE with it, per se. And so that inherently makes spears a less good weapon. And the design of leadership means that you tend to want to bring filler skills like Go for the Eyes that don't really do a whole lot, but you always bring them because that's how you're managing energy. And I think it's just very difficult with the way that they've set up the Paragon, with the way leadership works, for it to be something that functions in a way that is balanceable and can be good at a good level and can function in a way that people enjoy. That said, there are some very powerful Paragon builds. Paragon can be a very powerful profession, and it does have some good skills. It's just unfortunate that I think the overall design as it was concepted here and what's presented to us at this point in time is just a bit underwhelming and has some serious, what I would consider design flaws that make it difficult to design Paragon skills and things like that work well and within the conception of what the Paragon is. So there's going to be other stuff that I'm going to address during individual attribute lines. I do know that there were plans to overhaul the Paragon profession at one point in time, but unfortunately Guild Wars 2 killed them. So that's that. Let's go ahead, now that I've talked about skills and skill types and their signets and stuff too, let's talk about the Paragon's functionality a little bit more. So in terms of like what it does. So it also has, in addition to spears, which I've already mentioned, it has shields like a warrior does. They are linked to command and motivation. So you can get command shields, you can get motivation shields. They work like warrior shields. They give you 16 armor if you meet the requirement, and I believe usually like 6 or 8 armor or something like that if you don't, which adds some additional durability. In addition, Paragons have 80 armor, just 80 base armor. They don't get any special increased armor in terms of like plus 20 against physical like warriors do, or plus 30 against elemental like rangers do. So they just have that straight 80, but that means that they are, on their face, inherently tankier than almost all other professions. All of the casters have 60 base armor, and then ranger, dervish, and assassin all have 70 base. Rangers, of course, have the plus 30 against elemental, but anyway, it's important to recognize that there's a bunch of additional, or a decent amount of additional armor that the Paragon has. The Paragon also gets plus 10 energy, plus 5 from its gauntlets, and plus 5 from its chest piece, so for a base energy of 30. And they only have 2 pips of energy regeneration, just like warriors. But that's compensated for by leadership, technically. So leadership means that they have a much higher rate of energy return if they are using sort of their mechanics. So that has some consequences to it. One of the big ones is actually, depending upon how you set them up, Paragons do a decent job of using some of the more expensive skills and some of the other professions at a low quantity, like 2 or 3, because they can support that if they're bringing enough adrenaline-based skills to fund their energy expenditures. So that's an important thing to make note of. So, for example, Go for the Eyes is a shout that affects allies and can get you a bunch of energy. And something like Hexbreaker or Rhea can get you additional energy as well. So it does mean, though, that when you're building Paragon, you're basically always looking for what are you doing for energy management, and that's a question that comes up in all attribute lines. And there can be incentive to go kind of high in leadership for that to some extent. Otherwise, I mean, they have standard sets of runes that you'd expect, minor, major, and superior for each of their attributes. And I think they only have like 1 special insignia. We're going to go check. Yeah, they have the Centurion's insignia, which gives you plus 10 armor while you're affected by a shout, echo, or chant. So that's their custom insignia. Honestly, I don't think it's amazing, just because like there's other ways of getting plus 10 armor, but it's all right. I think that's kind of the general overview. I do feel that Paragons can add something to a party, but as a profession, it's very hit or miss. They can be very strong in very specific situations and with very specific builds, but a lot of stuff otherwise is just kind of... there's a lot of stuff that is kind of fillery, and if you're not specifically doing things to take advantage of the possibilities of some of your skills, as we'll see going forward, then they're probably really unexciting. So anyway, that's going to go ahead and wrap stuff up here. I think I've kind of said my piece. So we'll start next time with good old command. So until then, everyone, take care and goodbye. That late wave. Bye.